Mr. Speaker.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, there are 3 questions which I believe the people of New Zealand should be asking this government about this legislation. 1. How will this legislation create more homes for people? 2. How will this legislation reduce the cost of housing, stop the massive increase in rents, stop the ludicrous rises in house prices in Auckland without causing the bubble to burst? 3. How will the privatisation of state housing improve the quality and security of housing for the most vulnerable people in our communities? And I want to try to give some answers to those questions. So, to the first question about meeting the demand for rental homes, this legislation is not actually designed to increase rental housing stock. It is in fact designed firstly to minimise the role of the state by emasculating Housing New Zealand, effectively requiring it to sell houses and to build only in some areas in the nature of a residential property developer rather than a social housing provider. What is needed, of course, is an agency with a comprehensive role to provide a housing service for the lowest income people in the country, to insulate them from the worst effects of the worst landlords. Also, the bill eliminates Housing New Zealand's research and advice functions to the government, which seems very stupid to me because all of its expertise will be lost in that process. And the second part of the answer is that the legislation means the government is actually abdicating its responsibility for social housing by contracting that function to others. Organisations not actually always capable of carrying out that function. People without responsibility for the welfare of the tenants. Now, the Minister, Mr. Speaker, said in her speech that flexibility will allow tailored agreements to give certainty to providers so that they would be able to borrow and build more homes. But the truth, Mr. Speaker, is that Housing New Zealand could actually do that faster, it could build more homes, and it could build them better if it was properly resourced by the government to do so. So why go to housing providers outside government which don't have the capacity to do the job? It just doesn't make sense. And the third part of the answer, Mr. Speaker, is that the government, by providing far too little money for new rental housing to Housing New Zealand, shows that it is not really interested in solving the problem at all. And if that's not bad enough, the Principal Act amended by this legislation means that people are being pushed out of state houses, actually bullied out of them, through this policy of reviewable tenancy, which is based on a bureaucratic assessment of the ability of tenants to move into private accommodation for no apparent reason and without regard to their health or well-being, their community connections or their need for secure accommodation. Now, the legislation is also designed to avoid accountability. The government wants to be able to point the finger at somebody else when it is shown that not enough rental houses are being provided. It's this government's way of dealing with the social housing crisis by transferring it to others, by avoiding the heat, by leaving the kitchen. So the answer to the first question on increasing rental housing stock is that the legislation will not cause one new rental home to be built, and Housing New Zealand will not be resourced to do it either. It will be another tool to speed the sell-off of rental homes, and it will be used to justify less and less investment in new state rentals. It will make the crisis worse, not better. And ultimately that means more housing deprivation, and it will make state houses even harder to get than they are now. I want to move on to the second question about affordability. Mr. Speaker, the average rental is now $379 per week. Since 2008 under National, that's an increase of $65 per week, a 20.9% increase, 20.9%. And that's an increase above CPI of 11.7%. What does this mean? It actually means that in the main centres, rents have become unaffordable to people despite the rent subsidies offered by the government. And that's not the full story, because those figures that I gave are for all of New Zealand. The crisis is much greater in Auckland and in Christchurch. In Auckland, people typically spend half their income or more on rent, and that's unacceptable. In Christchurch, where I live, I hear stories all the time. People telling me that they're spending $1,000 a week for an ordinary 3-bedroom home because they can't find anything of reasonable quality for anything less. Those are facts. They're not just my opinions. They're what people tell me. It's the truth, and this government isn't addressing it in those main cities. People are still forced to live in cars, in caravans, in tents, under bridges, and in hovels not fit for human habitation. That's the record of this government, and that is not addressed at all in this legislation. So the answer to the question is this. This legislation is simply not capable of curbing even the rate of increase of rents, let alone reducing them at the present time. In fact, the legislation is more likely to cause increases in rents because the interest of private providers is in returns, not the welfare of tenants. Moving on to the third question on rental housing quality. Social housing will now be at very great arm's length from the government agencies that actually understand housing. So oversight will be seriously compromised as a result. More power is given to ministers to give directions on terms and conditions of contracts, but they are clearly going to take a very political, very dogmatic, ideology-driven approach to that. And that means under this government, it will be aimed at saving money with much less focus on looking at the best interests of the most vulnerable people in our communities. And non-government providers will impose their own policies and practices. And what that means, actually, is there will be no minimum satisfactory housing standards for rental properties in New Zealand. And we know where that leads. It leads entirely in the wrong direction. It means poor quality housing. And most of all, Mr. Speaker, this legislation will result in a very uncertain outcome for low-income people who are dependent on the state for housing and, above all, who need security in their tenancies, not uncertainty. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, the whole thrust of this government's housing program, as expressed in this amendment bill and in the Principal Act, is that they wish to suppress demand rather than meet demand. And the results of that will be very expensive in social terms. That will result in reduced health and well-being, increases in poverty, putting more families at risk and compromising social cohesion. This legislation is a retrograde step. It emasculates Housing New Zealand. It seeks to reduce government accountability. It does not increase housing supply. It does not control rocketing rents. It does not improve housing rental quality. It simply does not address the New Zealand housing crisis at all. What a shame. This government should be hanging its head in shame, not telling us that they're proud of this useless bill, because that's what it is. Somebody over there I see laughing at that, but the truth is, if he was one of the people affected, the smile would be on the other side of his face. This is poor legislation. It should not be passed.
I call